The Atlanta Falcons are burning down, and Kevin Stefanski started the fire. There are moments in professional sports that go far beyond wins and losses. Moments where a decision made inside a corporate boardroom sends shockwaves so powerful, so deep, and so personal that an entire city rises up in unified fury. What is happening right now in Atlanta, Georgia, is one of those moments. This is not a story about a bad draft pick. This is not a story about a disappointing season or a frustrating losing streak. This is a story about betrayal. It is a story about a calculated, deliberate act of sabotage against one of the most gifted young quarterbacks to enter the NFL in the last decade. And it is a story about a franchise that walked directly into a cultural minefield with its eyes wide open and somehow convinced itself it would come out the other side unscathed. They were catastrophically wrong. When the Atlanta Falcons announced the hiring of Kevin Stefanski as their new head coach, they expected pushback. Every major coaching hire comes with a vocal minority of unhappy fans. That is just the standard noise of the NFL offseason. What they did not expect, what they genuinely could not have predicted in their most paranoid nightmares, was the scale, the speed, and the raw emotional intensity of what came next. Within hours of the official announcement hitting the wires, Atlanta did not just push back, Atlanta detonated. Social media feeds were flooded with rage, local sports radio lines were completely overwhelmed, Falcons fan forums that normally discussed draft prospects and offensive schemes transformed overnight into organized war rooms. The city was not just disappointed, the city was personally offended. And when Atlanta takes something personally, the entire country feels it. To understand why this particular hire triggered such an explosive, unprecedented reaction, you have to go back to Cleveland. You have to sit in the cold, unforgiving reality of what Kevin Stefanski did to Shedeur Sanders, because this was not a simple personality clash between a veteran coach and a rookie quarterback who couldn't see eye to eye on the playbook. What happened in Cleveland was something far darker, far more calculated, and far more deliberate than a simple football disagreement. It was a systematic, methodical campaign to destroy a young man's professional reputation before it even had a chance to take root. And the receipts are everywhere. The assassination of a generational talent. Before Shedeur Sanders ever took a single snap in the NFL, the football world already knew it was looking at something special. The numbers he put up at the University of Colorado under his father's coaching program were not just impressive, they were historically anomalous. Over the course of 24 games in Boulder, Shedeur completed passes at a jaw-dropping 71.8% clip. He threw for over 7,000 yards. He piled up 64 touchdown passes against just 13 interceptions. His career passer rating was the kind of number that makes NFL scouts put down their coffee and sit up straight in their chairs. He was not just athletic, he was cerebral. He processed defenses at a speed that reminded veteran evaluators of the elite upper echelon quarterbacks they had spent careers scouting. He was a pocket surgeon with the emotional composure of a 10-year veteran and the arm talent of a first-round prospect. When Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, the expectation among football analysts, fans, and media members alike was that a young quarterback of that caliber would be developed with care, with patience, and with the kind of intentional coaching investment that turns raw potential into sustainable greatness. That is not what happened. What happened instead was that Kevin Stefanski looked at everything Shedeur Sanders represented and decided it was a threat. Not a threat to the opposing defense, a threat to his own job security, his own ego, and his own rigid, outdated offensive philosophy that had already chewed through more than a dozen quarterbacks over the course of his career without producing anything remotely resembling a sustainable winner. Stefanski's track record in Cleveland before Shedeur arrived was already telling a very clear story. His overall regular season record was stuck in mediocre sub-500 territory. The Browns had become synonymous with quarterback instability under his tenure, cycling through passer after passer as Stefanski relentlessly searched for someone willing to shrink themselves small enough to fit inside his inflexible system. He did not want a quarterback with a vision. He wanted an operator. He wanted someone who would execute his play calls robotically, without question, and without any instinct to deviate based on what the defense was actually showing. Shedeur Sanders was the exact opposite of that profile, and Kevin Stefanski never forgave him for it. The benching started almost immediately, despite it being painfully obvious to virtually every scout, analyst, and informed observer watching Cleveland's practices and preseason games that Shedeur was the most gifted quarterback in the building. Stefanski kept him anchored to the sideline, holding a clipboard. The stated reason was development. The real reason, as would eventually become devastatingly clear, was suppression. When Shedeur was finally inserted into games out of sheer desperation as the offense continued to sputter and stall, Stefanski did not unleash him, he caged him. The play calls that came in from the sideline were specifically, almost surgically designed to neutralize the exact qualities that made Shedeur special. His elite processing speed was wasted on slow-developing concepts that gave the defense time to reset. His vertical passing ability, one of the sharpest in his draft class, was rendered irrelevant by a horizontal, short-yardage game plan that any generic pocket presence could have executed. But even that level of calculated sabotage was not the most damaging weapon in Stefanski's arsenal. The most damaging weapon was the one wielded quietly, invisibly, and with maximum plausible deniability: the media leaks. Negative stories about Shedeur Sanders began appearing in Cleveland's local sports press with a suspicious, almost rhythmic regularity. Stories about his work ethic, questions about his attitude in the meeting room, whispers about his relationship with teammates and his willingness to embrace the grind of NFL preparation. None of these stories were sourced on the record. None of them came with names attached. They floated through the sports media ecosystem as anonymous tips, background briefings, and carefully placed insinuations. But anyone who had spent time around NFL organizations knew exactly where they were coming from and exactly why they were being planted. This was a classic old-school coaching survival play. When the system fails, make sure the quarterback gets the blame before the coach does. Protect the coordinator's chair by torching the rookie's reputation. It was cynical, it was cowardly, and it worked for a while. The city that never forgets. Atlanta fans are not passive consumers of professional football. They are deeply personally invested in the identity of their franchise in a way that goes far beyond Sunday afternoons and highlight reels. The Falcons are a cultural institution in that city, and the fan base has developed over decades a sharp, almost instinctual ability to detect when they are being disrespected. When Stefanski's hire was announced, that instinct did not just activate, it went into full emergency mode, because Atlanta fans did not need to wait for a long investigative report to tell them what had happened in Cleveland. They had already watched it unfold in real time. They had followed Shedeur's story closely, attentively, and with a personal investment that the Falcons' front office clearly never accounted for. The organizational expectation, as best as anyone close to the situation can read it, was that the initial wave of anger would behave like most NFL fan controversies behave. Loud for 48 hours, rapidly fading as the news cycle moved on, and ultimately absorbed into the passive acceptance that tends to accompany the start of a new season. The Falcons' leadership looked at their fan base and assumed they were dealing with the standard model of sports consumer frustration. They were not. They were dealing with something far more organized, far more motivated, and far more dangerous to the long-term health of the franchise than anything their crisis communications playbook had ever prepared them for. Within a single day of the announcement, a social media account operating under the name Fire Stefanski Now exploded across every major platform. It was not a slow burn, it was an immediate detonation. 50,000 followers in less than 24 hours. The account was not just posting angry memes and frustrated reaction content, it was publishing detailed, thoroughly researched threads laying out a comprehensive timeline of every documented instance of Stefanski's mismanagement of Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland. Video evidence, statistical comparisons, play-by-play breakdowns showing exactly how the offensive play calling had been specifically calibrated to limit rather than liberate. The account was doing the kind of investigative work that should have been done by the Falcons front office before they ever put pen to paper on that contract. Simultaneously, a dedicated Reddit community formed with the explicit purpose of organizing opposition to the hire. Within days, that community had swelled to over 30,000 active members. These were not casual observers venting into the digital void. These were engaged, motivated fans who were treating the situation with the seriousness and organizational discipline of a genuine civic campaign. They were creating shared documents, they were compiling evidence packages, they were coordinating messaging across platforms to ensure maximum visibility and maximum pressure on the people inside the Falcons organization who had the actual power to change the outcome. And then the movement left the internet entirely and showed up at the front door. On a Saturday morning that the Falcons' ownership will not forget for a very long time, over 2,000 fans descended on the team's practice facility in Flowery Branch, Georgia. They did not come quietly. They came with megaphones. They came with massive, professionally printed signs reading messages like, "Sabotage has no place in Atlanta," and "We won't forget what you did to Shedeur." They came with the specific, focused energy of people who had made a collective decision that politely expressing their displeasure through official channels was no longer sufficient. Local news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the scene live across the Atlanta metropolitan area. National sports networks broke into their regular programming to cover the demonstration. What had been framed internally by the Falcons as a manageable public relations challenge had transformed in full public view into a Category 5 organizational crisis, hitting them where it actually hurts. Protests outside a practice facility generate headlines, they generate social media moments, they generate uncomfortable morning meetings in executive conference rooms, but on their own, rarely generate the kind of sustained structural pressure that actually forces NFL organizations to reverse major personnel decisions. The people running professional football franchises are accustomed to absorbing public anger and waiting it out. They have done it before. They know that fan outrage, however intense, tends to have a relatively short shelf life when it is not connected to something that directly impacts the financial infrastructure of the organization. The brilliant, strategically sophisticated leaders of the Fire Stefanski movement understood this completely. They understood that shouting outside the building was a message, but canceling revenue was a mandate. So they pivoted from public demonstration to economic warfare with a precision and effectiveness that had the Falcons' front office genuinely rattled in a way that no amount of social media trending had managed to accomplish. To understand the true stakes of what these fans were threatening, you have to understand the financial scale of what they were putting on the table. Arthur Blank purchased the Atlanta Falcons back in 2002 for approximately $500 million. A significant sum at the time, but one that looks almost quaint compared to the current valuation of the franchise heading into the 2026 season. The Atlanta Falcons are currently valued at approximately $6.4 billion. That number represents not just an asset, but an entire economic ecosystem. Game day revenue, merchandise, broadcasting rights, sponsorship agreements, premium seating packages, club memberships. The machine generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, and it runs on one fundamental fuel source, the continued belief of its fan base that the product on the field and the people running the organization are worthy of their loyalty and their money. A coalition of more than 200 legacy season ticket holders, individuals who had held premium lower-level club seats for decades and whose annual payments represented some of the most reliable and lucrative revenue streams in the entire organization, drafted a formal, certified letter and sent it directly to Arthur Blank. The language of the letter was not emotional, it was not angry, it was coldly, precisely transactional. The message was simple and unambiguous. If Kevin Stefanski is standing on the Atlanta Falcons sideline as head coach when the 2026 season opens in September, we will not be renewing our season tickets. Full stop. No negotiation, no middle ground, no opportunity to talk them off the ledge with a PR statement and a meet-and-greet event. These were not empty threats delivered by anonymous accounts operating from behind a screen. Several of the most prominent members of this coalition immediately and publicly posted screenshots proving they had already contacted the Falcons ticket office and placed holds on their automatic renewal payments. The financial exposure this created was not theoretical, it was immediate, documented, and calculable. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in guaranteed revenue, potentially millions when secondary purchases, hospitality packages, and associated spending were factored into the equation. And that was just from the organized coalition of 200. The ripple effect through the broader season ticket base was exponentially larger and significantly harder to quantify, which made it even more terrifying for the people trying to run the numbers in the Falcons' business office. Corporate sponsors began making phone calls, not aggressive, threatening calls, something far more chilling in the corporate world, quiet, concerned calls. The kind of calls where a brand representative politely inquires about the direction of the franchise and mentions, almost casually, that there are some internal conversations happening about the optics of continued association. Every professional sports organization knows exactly what those calls mean. They mean the money is watching, and the money is not comfortable with what it is seeing. Local sports bars, which represent a significant and often overlooked component of NFL game day economic activity, began discussing organized boycotts of watch party events tied to Falcons games. The financial pressure was being applied from every angle simultaneously, and it was accumulating with a velocity that the front office had absolutely no prepared response for. The conversation nobody in the national media wants to have. There is a dimension to this story that the major national sports networks have been conspicuously, almost deliberately reluctant to address directly. It sits at the center of everything that is happening in Atlanta, and it is impossible to fully understand the depth of the community's rage without confronting it honestly and completely. The racial dynamics of this situation are not a sidebar. They are not an additional layer of context that provides a little extra background color to what is fundamentally a football story. They are the story. They are the reason this particular hire in this particular city generated this particular level of fury. The NFL entered the current coaching cycle already carrying significant scrutiny around its diversity hiring practices. The numbers have been discussed extensively in sports media, but the core reality is stark and difficult to argue with. Black athletes make up the majority of players on NFL rosters. The athleticism, the skill, the physical sacrifice that generates the billions of dollars that keep this league operating at its astronomical scale comes overwhelmingly from black men. And yet, when you look at the head coaching ranks of the league, the demographics tell an entirely different story. The pipeline from playing talent to leadership opportunity has been historically constricted in ways that the league has publicly acknowledged, addressed through policy measures like the Rooney Rule, and nevertheless continued to struggle with in ways that the annual coaching hire cycles make very difficult to ignore. Against this backdrop, the specific circumstances of what happened in Cleveland land with an entirely different weight. You have a white head coach with a documented, extensively analyzed history of systematically undermining a supremely confident, openly expressive, culturally distinct black quarterback. The benching was not colorblind organizational management. The play calling restrictions were not applied equally to every quarterback on the roster. The media leaks did not begin circulating about every player who struggled within Stefanski's system. They targeted Shedeur Sanders specifically, consistently, and with a precision that many observers found difficult to attribute solely to football disagreements. The language used in fan communities and by prominent local voices in Atlanta when discussing the hire has been specific and unflinching. The phrase that has appeared repeatedly in social media posts and in public statements and in interviews with longtime Falcons supporters is plantation mentality. It is a charged phrase. It is a historically loaded phrase, and the people using it are using it deliberately and purposefully to describe what they see as a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond Stefanski's specific coaching decisions. They are describing what they perceive as a systemic tendency in certain corners of the coaching profession to demand submissiveness, conformity, and the suppression of individual identity from black quarterbacks in particular. Shedeur Sanders does not fit that mold. He has never fit that mold. His father did not fit that mold. And the fans of Atlanta are drawing a very direct line between the two generations of that family and the specific type of resistance they have faced from the institutional power structures of professional football. Atlanta is not just a large city with a significant black population. It is widely recognized as the cultural capital of Black America. The Atlanta Metropolitan Statistical Area is home to over 6 million people, with a black community that is not just numerically significant, but economically powerful. Culturally influential and deeply proud of the specific identity the city has built over generations. Atlanta is the city of Black Wall Street rebuilt. It is the home of historically black colleges and universities that have produced generations of leaders across every field. It is the birthplace of the civil rights movement's intellectual and organizational infrastructure. It is a city where black excellence is not just celebrated, but expected, demanded, and fiercely protected. The identity of the Falcons fan base is inseparable from the identity of Atlanta itself. And when the front office of that franchise made a decision that the city interpreted as a direct insult to black talent and black dignity, the response was not going to be muted or patient or willing to give the benefit of the doubt. Primetime shadow hangs over everything. If the Falcons front office had done nothing more than fail to properly account for the Shedeur Sanders situation in Cleveland, they would have had a significant problem on their hands. But they did not just fail to account for the Cleveland situation, they also failed to account for something that any Atlanta fan could have told them in about 30 seconds. They failed to account for what the name Sanders means in that city. Rewind the tape to the 1989 NFL Draft. The Atlanta Falcons hold the 5th overall pick. With that selection, they take a player out of Florida State University who will go on to become arguably the most electrifying, charismatic, and culturally impactful athlete in the history of the franchise, Deion Sanders. Primetime, the man who turned the Atlanta Falcons into must-see television during an era when the franchise had historically struggled to generate sustained excitement or national relevance. Deion did not just play football in Atlanta. He transformed the entire cultural identity of the organization. He brought an energy, a swagger, a showmanship, and a sense of occasion to the Falcons that the franchise had never experienced before, and has spent the decades since desperately, unsuccessfully, attempting to recreate. He was simultaneously a baseball player for the Atlanta Braves, hitting home runs for one Atlanta sports institution in the afternoon and returning interceptions for touchdowns for another one in the evening. He was the dual sport king of the city. He was the face that casual sports fans and non-sports fans alike associated with Atlanta professional sports during that era. His primetime persona was not just a nickname, it was a cultural identity that the entire city adopted as its own. When Deion Sanders left Atlanta, he took something irreplaceable with him. The franchise has known it ever since. The connection between the city of Atlanta and the Sanders family bloodline is not abstract nostalgia. It is a living, breathing, deeply personal thing for the fan base. When Deion Sanders took over the coaching program at Colorado and began building something extraordinary, and when his son Shedeur emerged as the centerpiece of that program and began generating legitimate NFL draft buzz, Atlanta fans followed that story with an intensity that went beyond normal football interest. They followed it as a family story, as a continuation of a legacy that the city of Atlanta has a proprietary emotional claim to. Shedeur Sanders is not just an NFL prospect, he is Primetime's son. He carries a name that means something specific and sacred in that city.
So when the Falcons front office decided to hire Kevin Stefanski, the man who spent an entire NFL season attempting to quietly, methodically dismantle the career of primetime Sun before it had a chance to begin, they did not just make a bad business decision, they committed what the fanbase experienced as an act of cultural desecration. They brought the enemy into the house that primetime built. They handed the keys to the man who tried to humiliate the heir of the most beloved
athlete in franchise history. They did it without apparent awareness of what they were doing, and that lack of awareness, that complete failure to understand the emotional architecture of their own fan base, may prove to be the most costly organizational mistake the franchise has made in a very long time. The fans are not letting it go quietly. They have made that emphatically, unmistakably clear. You do not get to walk into primetime City wearing his franchise's colors after what you did to his son and expect to be received with polite acceptance in a reasonable transition period. That is not how Atlanta works. That is not how the Sanders legacy works, and the front office is discovering that truth in the most expensive, embarrassing, and public way imaginable. The revolt happening behind closed doors. One of the most striking and genuinely unprecedented aspects of this entire situation is something that has received far less coverage than the public protests and the ticket cancellations. It is what is happening inside the Atlanta Falcons locker room itself. The current players on the roster, the men who will actually be asked to execute Kevin Stefanski's game plans on Sunday afternoons, are not standing behind their new head coach with enthusiasm and confidence. According to multiple deeply sourced insider reports from people with direct access to the locker room environment, the internal reaction to the Stefanski hire among the players has been one of significant, widespread, and growing discomfort. The most visible manifestation of this discomfort has been a series of closed-door, players-only meetings that have allegedly taken place since the hire was announced. These are not the kind of informal hangouts and team-building sessions that happen organically throughout an NFL offseason. These are structured, purposeful gatherings where veterans have been expressing their genuine concerns about the direction of the franchise and about what the Stefanski hire means for their individual careers and for the overall trajectory of the team. Multiple sources describe the atmosphere in these meetings as tense, serious, and deeply skeptical about whether this head coach can be trusted to develop talent, protect his players, and take accountability when the results on the field do not match the expectations. The reasoning behind the locker room's internal resistance is not difficult to understand when you think through it carefully. These are professional football players. Studying tape and analyzing the actions of coaches is a fundamental part of their professional existence. Every player in that locker room has watched what happened to Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland. They did not just watch it as fans watching a drama unfold from a safe distance. They watched it as professionals watching a cautionary tale play out in vivid, terrifying detail. They watched a quarterback who was demonstrably talented, demonstrably prepared, and demonstrably capable of competing at the NFL level get systematically sidelined, restricted, undermined, and ultimately buried under an avalanche of carefully orchestrated negative press. The question that every player in the Atlanta locker room is asking themselves, consciously or not, is not complicated. If Kevin Stefanski was willing to do that to Shedeur Sanders, one of the most high-profile, closely watched, intensely scrutinized rookie quarterbacks of his generation, with Deion Sanders himself watching from the outside and the entire sports media ecosystem paying close attention, what is he going to do to them when they struggle? When they have a bad game, when they disagree with a play call, when their individual style of play creates friction with his preferred system? If he was capable of that level of political maneuvering and reputational damage against someone with that much visibility and that powerful a family connection, he would do it to any of them without hesitation when his own job security demanded it. The trapped nature of the player's situation adds a particularly painful dimension to this story. NFL contracts contain strict non-disparagement clauses that effectively prevent players from publicly criticizing coaches, management, or organizational decisions without exposing themselves to severe financial and professional consequences. The fines associated with public criticism of team personnel can be enormous. The professional stigma of being labeled a locker room cancer by the league's ownership community can be career-ending. Players who have spoken out against coaching decisions in the past have found themselves quietly blacklisted, struggling to find new contracts and watching their careers dissolve far earlier than their talent warranted. The risks of public dissent in the NFL are real, documented, and deeply understood by everyone inside the system. But the players found a way. Reports have emerged describing a remarkable, genuinely unprecedented phenomenon. Current Falcons players using anonymous digital back channels to make direct contact with the organizers of the fan protest movement outside the building. These contacts are not casual, they are not accidental, they are deliberate, purposeful outreach from professional athletes who are silenced by their contracts, but who are desperate to find a way to make their voices heard on an issue that directly affects their professional lives and futures. The message being conveyed through these anonymous channels is reported to be consistent and unambiguous. Keep applying the pressure. We cannot say it publicly, our contracts will not allow it, but we agree with everything you are doing, and we are grateful that someone out there is fighting the fight that we are not allowed to fight for ourselves. The implications of this kind of alliance between a fan protest movement and the players it is ostensibly advocating for are extraordinary. In the history of professional sports in America, the relationship between fan activism and player interests has almost always been indirect and assumed rather than explicit and coordinated. Players have benefited from supportive fan sentiment without actively cultivating or directing it. What is allegedly happening in Atlanta is something qualitatively different. It is a secret coalition, a clandestine partnership between the visible face of fan resistance and the invisible internal voice of locker room dissent, working in coordinated parallel toward the same goal. Whether or not that goal is ultimately achieved, the existence of this dynamic represents something genuinely new in the landscape of professional sports labor relations, and it speaks to just how seriously the players are taking the situation they find themselves in. The executive suite is on fire. While fans rage outside the building and players quietly revolt within it, the internal atmosphere in the Atlanta Falcons executive offices has reportedly deteriorated into something approaching full organizational crisis. The comfortable corporate confidence that accompanied the Stefanski hire announcement has evaporated entirely, replaced by a frantic, blame-heavy scramble to understand how things went so wrong so fast, and, more urgently, to figure out what to do about it before the damage becomes permanent. Arthur Blank is not a passive owner. He is engaged, demanding, and deeply invested in the reputation and performance of the franchise he has spent over 2 decades building into one of the NFL's premier organizations. By all accounts, his current mood regarding the situation surrounding the Stefanski hire ranges from deeply frustrated to genuinely furious, and significant portions of that anger are reportedly being directed inward at the people in his own organization who brought him to this point. The internal question consuming the executive staff is a simple but devastating one. Who actually pushed the hardest for this hire? Who is responsible for what is shaping up to be one of the most catastrophic public relations disasters in the franchise's recent history? The general manager's office is under intense scrutiny. The ownership group's role in the decision-making process is being examined with a level of critical intensity that rarely characterizes post-hire reflection in normal circumstances. Assistant executives and scouts, who may have privately expressed reservations about the hire at the time, are now navigating the politically treacherous terrain of distancing themselves from a decision that is collapsing around them in real time. The Public Relations Department, which should be operating as a stabilizing force during a period of crisis, is reportedly in complete disarray. Emergency meetings are being called and then called again. Crisis communication strategies are being drafted and then discarded when the ground shifts before they can be implemented. Every prepared statement, every carefully worded public response,
Every attempt to get ahead of the narrative is being overtaken by the next wave of organized fan pressure before it can gain any traction. The downstream consequences of this situation extend well beyond the immediate optics problem. NFL teams operate in a highly competitive market for elite free agent talent, and that market is profoundly sensitive to the organizational culture signals that individual franchises broadcast. Top-tier free agents, the kind of established, proven playmakers who can meaningfully accelerate a team's competitive trajectory, have options. They have agents, they have advisors, they have the ability to choose their next destination based on factors that go far beyond the size of the contract offer. Organizational stability matters. Coaching culture matters. The perception of how a franchise treats its players matters enormously when a veteran with a family and a career timeline is making a decision about where he wants to spend the next chapter of his professional life. What free agent, looking at the situation in Atlanta right now, sees stability? What established receiver or elite pass rusher looks at a franchise currently at war with its own fan base, with a coaching hire that has triggered protests outside the practice facility and mass season ticket cancellation threats, and decides that this is the right environment for the prime years of his career? The scouts and player personnel executives inside the Falcons organization are reportedly voicing exactly these concerns, understanding that the collateral damage of this coaching controversy extends far beyond the current news cycle and could fundamentally compromise the team's ability to build a competitive roster in the near and medium term. The reckoning arrives. The pressure accumulated to a level that could no longer be managed through silence or carefully worded statements filtered through the public relations department. Falcons president Matt Ryan, operating in a role entirely different from his celebrated playing days in that same city, found himself with no remaining option but to face the public directly. An emergency press conference was announced, scheduled for the afternoon of a day that the Atlanta Falcons organization had clearly hoped would look very different. The stated purpose of the press conference was to address the controversy surrounding the Stefanski hire. The unstated purpose was survival. Every person who has followed this story knows the question sitting at the center of that press conference, the question that every reporter in the room, every fan watching the live stream, and every player and executive in the building was waiting to have answered. Is the Atlanta Falcons?
Is the organization going to stand behind Kevin Stefanski? Or is Arthur Blank going to make the call that the city is demanding and begin the process of finding a head coach that Atlanta can actually get behind? The math of the situation is not complicated when you lay it out plainly. On one side of the ledger, you have a head coach with a mediocre track record, a documented history of mismanaging quarterback talent, and a specific incident involving Shedeur Sanders that has made him radioactive in one of the most culturally sensitive NFL markets in the country. On the other side, you have a fan base that is organized, financially motivated, and has demonstrated through concrete action that it is prepared to follow through on its threats. You have players who are internally aligned with the resistance, but legally prevented from expressing that alignment publicly. You have corporate sponsors making uncomfortable phone calls. You have a franchise valuation that depends entirely on continued consumer confidence. You have the legacy of one of the most beloved athletes in franchise history hanging over the entire situation like a judgment. The Falcons have survived difficult periods before. Every franchise in professional sports has. They have survived bad rosters and poor draft decisions and seasons that tested the patience of even their most loyal supporters. But the crisis unfolding right now is different in a way that experienced sports business observers have noted with genuine concern. This is not a performance crisis. This is a values crisis. And values crises, when they are deeply rooted in cultural identity and personal loyalty the way this one is, do not resolve themselves through winning a few games in September. They require a fundamental acknowledgement of what went wrong, who is responsible for it, and what specific actions are being taken to ensure it never happens again. The Falcons of Atlanta are not asking for a championship. They are not asking for a perfect offensive game plan or a first-round draft pick at cornerback. They are asking for something far more basic and far more profound. They are asking to be respected. They are asking for an organization that understands what this city is, what it stands for, and what it will and will not accept from the people entrusted with representing it on the national stage every Sunday. They are asking for accountability. Whether Kevin Stefanski ultimately survives this moment or not, the story of what happened in Atlanta in the weeks following his hiring will be studied and discussed in sports business classrooms and NFL front offices for years to come. It is a masterclass in the catastrophic consequences of organizational tone deafness. It is a demonstration of what happens when a billion-dollar sports franchise fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between its brand and the community that owns that brand in every way that actually matters. The fans do not hold the deed to the building, but they hold something more powerful than that. They hold the meaning of the whole thing. And when you lose that, you have lost everything that cannot be recovered with a press conference or a press release or a carefully coordinated social media rollout. Atlanta is watching, Atlanta is waiting, and Atlanta, as Kevin Stefanski and the people who hired him are learning in real time, does not forget.